Hi, my name is Arlena Whitlow. I was a mother, a grandmother, a co-signer, and eventually a ghost in my own family on Mother's Day. My son texted me, "Sorry, Mom, today is my wife's first Mother's Day." And just like that, I became an afterthought. But it didn't stop there. They erased my name from photos, sold the locket my late husband gave me, and quietly planned to move me into a retirement home I'd never seen. Was I ever really part of their family, or just the wallet holding it together? I woke up before the sun did, as I always did every second Sunday of May. The house, still cloaked in the quiet hush of dawn, didn't argue. I reached for my robe, slipped into my slippers, and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. The floor creaked under my feet, the same way it had for over 2 decades. The kettle hissed to life, and I pulled out the good china, just 2 cups, as I'd always done. The second was for Dorian. Even if he hadn't sat across from me on a Mother's Day morning in the past 3 years. Still, tradition was stubborn, and so was I. I prepared the table for 2. The cloth was freshly pressed, the jam was homemade, the bread sliced neatly beside my ceramic butter dish with the tiny painted daffodils. Hope, I've learned, is quiet. It doesn't shout. It waits. The chime of my phone disrupted the soft ritual. I reached for it with a flutter in my chest, recognizing my son's name on the screen. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe he was outside, pulling into the driveway with Nova and a bunch of tulips behind his back. Instead, there was a message. Just a message. "Sorry, Mom, today is Selena's first Mother's Day. Hope you understand." There were no periods, no heart emojis, no pictures. Just that. I read it again, and then once more, because the first time didn't hurt enough. My finger hovered over the reply button, but I didn't press it. I just set the phone face down on the table. The china rattled slightly as I pulled the chair out and sat. The food stared back at me. Toast, still warm, butter melting in soft pools. I reached for the jam, but my appetite had taken the back exit. Across from me, the second cup sat untouched. I remembered when he was little and drew me a stick figure with wild hair and labeled it "Best Mom Ever." It's still on my fridge, tucked behind a magnet shaped like Idaho. Dorian used to climb into my lap with sticky fingers and whisper, "You're my favorite person." I hadn't heard those words in a long time. It's not the absence of those words that hurt. It's knowing they were replaced with new favorites, new rituals, in which I had no part. The mailbox held a single envelope. Neat handwriting, Celine's. I opened it carefully, half hoping for a child's crayon scrawl. Inside was a pastel card. No glitter, no photo, just a pre-printed greeting and, in pen, 3 words. Love, Nova. That was it. No dear grandma. No happy Mother's Day. Just a child's name, like I was the mail carrier, like I was the afterthought. I stood there on the porch, card in hand, while the neighbor across the street watered her hanging plants, waving like it was just another ordinary day. But it wasn't. It was the day I realized they'd stopped seeing me. I walked back inside and removed the second place setting. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I didn't even sigh. I folded the napkin and returned the butter to the fridge. It was quiet work, but not gentle. My hands shook a little. Not from rage, no. Rage has volume. This was something else. I once read that grief isn't the loudest thing in a room. It's the place setting that gets put away without being used. It's knowing no one noticed it was ever there. Maybe this is what aging is. Not being hated. Just being edited out of the picture softly, so it doesn't make noise. Later that afternoon, I sat on the couch, a cup of lukewarm tea in hand. My fingers traced the rim absently as Nova's voice echoed in my head. A few months ago, during a short visit, She had tried to climb into my lap. "Let's not tire Grandma," Celine had said, gently but firmly, scooping her up. "She's old, remember." Nova nodded like she'd just been handed a fact like gravity or taxes. That moment had stuck with me like lint in a sweater. Today, it returned with sharper edges. I wasn't Grandma anymore. Not the version that gets birthday drawings and sticky kisses. I was someone to be preserved, managed, sidestepped. And I suddenly knew I had been quietly replaced, and no one had the decency to tell me. The house still smelled of rosemary and warm bread, even though it was already late in the afternoon. I'd spent most of the day moving slowly, taking care with every slice of cucumber, every fold of the cloth napkins. The roast had come out just right, the skin golden, the meat tender. I lit a single candle. It was too early for dinner, but I always liked how the flickering glow made the dishes shimmer. I set 2 plates, like I always had. Dorian used to prefer the side chair. Nova loved the high stool. I chose the one closest to the window. I sent a text short and sweet, "Dinner's ready when you are." Then I waited. I didn't play music. I didn't touch the wine. I just waited. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I checked my phone, half hoping for a voice memo with Nova's giggle in the background. Instead, just a new message from Dorian Nova's fussy. "We're exhausted. Sorry, Mom. Next weekend." That was it. Next weekend. A reschedule like it was a dentist appointment. I stared at the text for a while, then slid the phone across the table and watched it bump gently against the butter dish. I took the first bite of dinner alone. It was still warm. The rolls were soft. I didn't taste a thing. After dinner, I cleared the table with the kind of efficiency that comes from muscle memory, not purpose. I wrapped the leftovers neatly enough for lunch, for dinner tomorrow, maybe even to freeze. The second plate looked untouched, almost pristine. I paused before washing it, my hands hovering just above the edge. It looked so carefully prepared, like a gift never opened. How many meals had I eaten alone lately? When had that become normal? I couldn't remember the last time Dorian brought a bottle of wine, or Nova drew something from my fridge. Maybe this wasn't new. Maybe I was just finally paying attention. I settled into my armchair and opened the tablet resting on the side table. A routine check of emails turned into instinctive scrolling through Facebook. There it was. Dorian's post, bright and polished like a commercial. So proud of the amazing mom Celine is becoming. First Mother's Day. Grateful. No mention of me, no tag, no sign I'd ever existed on that day. I tapped on the photos, Celine beaming in a blush-colored dress, Nova in matching pastels, Dorian with his hand on Selena's back. Caption, celebrating the heart of our family. I blinked twice, but the words didn't change. My thumb hovered above the screen, frozen. They'd gone out. Brunch, clearly. Matching outfits, clearly planned. Smiles that looked sincere. There were mimosas and flowers and a cake that said, "Best Mom Ever." I looked at the half-eaten roast still cooling on my stove. There were no photos of me, not even a quiet acknowledgement in his caption. They took the holiday meant for me and handed it to someone else like passing a bouquet to a new winner, while the last one quietly slipped off stage. I set the tablet down, gently. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't tremble. But something had changed in my chest. Not like a snap, no. It was quieter than that. A shift. Like a door closing down a long hallway. I didn't think Dorian hated me. I don't even think Celine did. But I knew now I wasn't in their story anymore. At least, not in the parts worth sharing. I wasn't the heart of the family. I was a parenthesis, a footnote. I'd been made invisible. And worse, I'd let them. Later that night, I sat on the couch with a glass of water, flipping through old photos on my phone. Mother's Day, 5 years ago. Nova was barely walking. Her hands were chubby and sticky with strawberry jam. She was in my arms, laughing. I remembered how her hair smelled like lavender shampoo. We'd made pancakes. She poured in too much syrup. Dorian took the photo. 3 generations of love. He'd captioned it back then. I looked at it for a long moment, then pressed delete. Then another. One by one. I removed them not from pain, but to make room. Room for silence. Room for clarity. Room, maybe, for a future where I was no longer waiting to be invited back in. The phone rang just after the sun disappeared behind the neighbor's chimney. I was rinsing my cup from lunch, a cup that had been refilled 3 times that day, each with tea I never finished. I dried my hands and answered. Happy Mother's Day. Arlena, Grace said cheerfully. I could hear the clinking of silverware and voices in the background. Her family was there, as always. She went on about how grown her grandkids had become, how her daughter made lemon bars from scratch this time. I smiled, genuinely happy for her, until she asked, Did you get a good family photo this year? I saw Dorian's post so lovely. The question hung in the air for half a breath too long. Yes, I lied. They celebrated earlier in the week. The word slid out with a practiced smoothness, like a bandage tugged off skin that had already scarred. When people go missing long enough, you start creating reasons not to feel abandoned. After we hung up, I stayed by the phone, unsure whether I felt more drained by the call or by the effort it took to sound unhurt. The silence afterward pressed against me like thick fog. It wasn't Grace's fault. She didn't know. She only saw what Dorian chose to show, but my own voice had startled me. It had sounded rehearsed, too clean, too calm, like it belonged to someone who had been managing disappointments for years and finally knew the right volume to set it at. I stood by the window for a while, watching a squirrel dart across the yard, chasing nothing. Really, just moving because it felt better than standing still. Eventually, I made my way to the guest bedroom. The closet was packed with things I hadn't touched in ages-old coats, mismatched pillowcases, dusty puzzles, but I was looking for something specific. I pulled down the box from the top shelf with both hands, careful not to drop it. Inside was a world I used to live in, Dorian school projects. One was a drawing of a giraffe with a speech bubble that read, "My mom is taller than the sky." Another was a Mother's Day card cut out in the shape of a heart, covered in glitter that still shed on my fingers. These tiny declarations of love once meant the world to me. Now they felt like postcards from a planet I could no longer visit. I sat on the floor, that open box in front of me, and let the quiet settle around my shoulders. My mind wandered to the last time Dorian had hugged me. It had been 2 years ago at the hospital after I had gallbladder surgery. I was groggy from the anesthesia, half lucid. When he entered the room, he leaned in stiffly, placed one hand on my shoulder, then halfway through the embrace, his phone rang. It was Celine. He pulled back, muttered, "Sorry, Mom," and stepped outside to answer. I remembered the warmth of his palm disappearing from my skin, like steam dissipating. That hug had been fleeting and final. Later that night, long after I had packed the memory box away, I found myself staring at the ceiling above my bed, wondering, was that the last hug because it hurt him, or because it didn't? The ache wasn't just emotional. It settled deep in my bones, the kind that makes you curl into yourself without realizing. I didn't want an apology anymore. I just wanted to know where I stood in the chapters of his life if I was a footnote, or worse, already edited out. As I reached for my water glass on the nightstand, my hand brushed against something in the drawer. I pulled it out, a folded slip of yellowed paper, soft at the creases, Dorian's handwriting childlike, uneven, full of effort. "I love you forever. Mommy," it said. He must have written it when he was 8. I'd carried it in my wallet for years. Somewhere along the way, it had been replaced by insurance cards, grocery receipts, and emergency contacts. But this little note had stayed. I slipped it back into my wallet, not because I still believed it, but because I needed to remember that once. Someone did. I reorganized the kitchen cabinets just after sunrise. The sugar had no business next to the lentils, and the mugs were too far from the kettle. These weren't problems, really just distractions with labels. I shifted jars, wiped shelves, lined up the spices like soldiers. My hands needed something to do. In the stillness, the clinks and clatters felt like a conversation I could control. It wasn't until I opened the drawer with the serving platters that I noticed half of my good dishware was missing. Not stolen, just borrowed, gradually, on visits to Dorian's house over the years. A bowl here, a serving spoon there. I'd seen them at his place, of course, but I had told myself they were extras. Now I saw them clearly for what they were. Not keepsakes, replacements. Celine's choices had slowly filled the shelves. My choices had been quietly packed away. I went to my bedroom and opened the top drawer of the dresser. I hadn't meant to look for anything in particular, but my fingers knew their way. Under a layer of scarves was a cream envelope with Harlan's handwriting on the front. I hadn't read it in over a year. It was dated the spring before he passed. I sat on the edge of the bed and slid the letter out, unfolding the crisp paper with care. His words were steady. "If our son forgets who raised him, remind him gently, or not at all." I read that line aloud, voice low and hollow. Harlan always had a way of sounding kind even when he was furious. He believed in dignity sometimes to a fault. That letter had comforted me once. Today, it felt like a dare. By mid-morning, I was behind the wheel, driving with no clear destination until the turns brought me to Dorian's neighborhood. The house sat on a tidy corner lot, blooming hydrangeas along the walkway. I remembered the excitement on Dorian's face when we signed the paperwork. I had wired $80,000 from the inheritance Harlan left me. "It's your foundation, son." I had said, "Build something that lasts." He hugged me hard that day. It was one of the last hugs that felt real. Now, sitting outside in my car, I felt like an uninvited guest in a story I helped finance. The house was painted a soft gray now, Celine's favorite. Dorian stepped out onto the porch, casual as ever. "Hey, Mom," he said with a smile. "Welcome to Selana's house. She made this a home." My chest tightened, but I returned the smile. I followed him inside, through a hallway of framed photos, Celine holding Nova, Celine at a garden party, Nova asleep on Celine's shoulder. Not a single picture of me, not even in the background. The kitchen had been remodeled granite counters, new fixtures. My mother's baking tin sat on top of the fridge, spray-painted white. Thought it clashed with the new look. Celine had once joked. Celine greeted me warmly, offered a glass of wine. "So glad you could see what we've built together." I nodded, scanning the room like a stranger at an open house. "You built it with bricks I paid for." I thought, "But I guess you get to decorate the truth too." I declined the drink, citing errands, and hugged Nova briefly before making my way to the door. No one tried to stop me. As I walked to the car, I noticed the doormat. It read, "Welcome to our forever." For a moment, I wasn't sure if it was a sentiment or a warning. Back home. I placed Harlan's letter on the table and read it again. The line struck differently now. "Remind him gently," or not at all. No. Harlan. That wasn't going to be enough. I had reminded him gently. I had waited. I had smiled through every exclusion, accepted every redefinition of my role until I didn't recognize myself anymore. The kindness you believed in, it had become my silence, and it hadn't saved me. I folded the letter, placed it back in its envelope, and whispered aloud to the empty room, "You were wrong, Harlan." Reminding him gently didn't work. Now I need to remind him clearly. The mailbox creaked when I opened it, the way it always did when the wind picked up across the lawn. I reached in and found a single envelope cream-colored, with cartoon balloons across the top and Nova's name written in curly font. The postmark said Saturday. Today was Thursday. The party date was last Sunday. I stared at the invitation for a while, standing barefoot on the front steps. It hadn't gotten lost. It hadn't been delayed. It had been sent late on purpose. A formality, perhaps, to say they'd invited me, but not in time for me to actually show. I read the text on the card, "Come celebrate Nova's 6th" in bold. There was glitter on the edge, a small fingerprint-sized smudge of frosting on the corner, like someone had touched it with hands still sticky from cake. Someone who had been there. I went inside and placed the invitation on the refrigerator. I didn't pin it for memory. I pinned it as evidence. As proof. The magnet held it beside a coupon for mulch I never used. I poured myself a cup of coffee, then let it sit untouched. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the kitchen floor. I stared at the card and thought, if I'm not in their plans, I won't be in their memories either. That idea didn't make me cry. It didn't even sting. It just settled somewhere below my ribs and refused to leave, like a weight you don't notice until you try to breathe deeply. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store for eggs and onions. It was supposed to be a quick trip. In the checkout line, I heard my name, Arlena. It was Mrs. Paget from 2 streets over. She looked the same: floral blouse, bright lipstick, always chipper. Didn't Celine post the sweetest pictures she gave her mom a gold necklace for Mother's Day? So thoughtful. She smiled as she placed her milk on the belt. Then, as if remembering her manners, she added, "Did you get something special too?" I forced a polite smile. "Just quiet," I said. It came out softer than I expected. Mrs. Paget nodded kindly, unaware of the incision she'd made. Gold for one woman. Silence for another. That was the currency now. The air outside felt thicker than it had earlier. I sat on the bench just past the automatic doors, my bag of groceries pressed against my knee. A child squealed nearby, chasing a cart that wouldn't roll straight. I didn't look up. I just stared ahead. My mind had already wandered back to Nova's 3rd birthday party. I'd made cupcakes from scratch, bought icing nozzles just to pipe little roses. Dorian had helped me string streamers across the backyard. We'd laughed when the wind knocked down the banner. That version of motherhood, the one where I was necessary, welcome, essential, had quietly expired. Not with a fight, but with neglect. I walked home. Slowly. I needed the air. Even if it didn't help, each step tapped out a thought. They want to edit me out softly. They hope I'll disappear politely, but I'm not a pencil mark, and I won't be erased that way. By the time I reached the front steps, the ache in my calves mirrored the pressure building in my chest. Not sadness, not yet rage, but something close to momentum. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it, but I knew it wouldn't sit quietly any longer. Back inside, I headed straight for the filing cabinet in the corner of my living room. It still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. I opened the second drawer. The folder was there labeled Home Loan Dorian. Inside was the co-signature document from when he bought the house. My signature, clear and centered. Below it, the line item $80,000 wired from my account. I pulled out the deed copy. My name was never added to the title. Just like we'd agreed temporary help, he'd called it. But that was before I realized temporary also meant disposable. I placed the documents on my desk, side by side. If they wanted to throw parties without me, that was their choice. But I was the one who paid for the roof above the cake, and that wouldn't be forgotten. The banker was younger than my son, maybe by 10 years. He smiled politely, asked how my morning was, and offered coffee I didn't accept. His nameplate read Elliot Graves, though I couldn't remember if he'd introduced himself or if I had simply read it upside down while placing my bag on the desk. "How can I help you today?" "Mrs. Whitlow." I pulled out the folder with the stamped envelope and papers I had pre-reviewed 3 times before leaving the house. I'd like to remove my son from joint access to my account. He blinked once, then nodded. No questions, no hesitation. The paperwork was familiar to him, just as it had become familiar to me. I signed where he highlighted, my hand steady. No shaking, no guilt. Just ink. He slid the final form into a folder marked processed. For years, I'd let people think silence meant peace, but this silence was different. It was precision. Back home. I opened the fireproof box in my closet and added the documents to the folder I had labeled Final Rights 2 nights before. I ran my fingers across the plastic tabs. There was no ceremony. No feeling of victory, just finality. They took me out of their future. I just made sure they weren't in mine. I closed the box and slid it back into the corner behind the old tax returns and a photo album they hadn't asked to see in years. For the first time in weeks, I sat down without pacing. I didn't turn on the TV or make tea. I just listened to the sound of my house settling around me. The knock came late in the afternoon, soft but unmistakable. When I opened the door, Dorian stood there holding a trifold brochure in his hand. His expression was apologetic in that practiced way people use when they're trying not to sound rehearsed. "Celine found this place," he said, stepping inside. "It's called Serenity Living, Independent and Supported Care. They have a gardening program." She thought, "Maybe you'd be less alone there." He laid the brochure on my dining table like it was a peace offering. I looked at the glossy images, smiling seniors playing bingo, a woman painting in a sunlit room. "It's beautiful," I said gently. I didn't know safety came with a brochure. He hesitated, unsure if I was joking or insulting. I gave him nothing to work with. I thanked him for the thought. Then I walked to my filing cabinet and pulled open the drawer. Without a word, I slid the Serenity brochure under the signed bank document. I didn't say what it meant. I didn't need to. If they want me shelved, I thought, let's make sure the shelf is mine. I turned and smiled. "Tell Celine I appreciate the research." He nodded, looked relieved. I walked him to the door and didn't hug him goodbye. I stood at the window after he left, arms crossed loosely, watching the car back out of my driveway. Celine was in the passenger seat, sunglasses on, smiling, not at me, not about me, just smiling. Efficient. That was the word. They weren't cruel, just efficient, and somehow that cut deeper. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being left out, but from being efficiently replaced. They had streamlined their lives to function without me, removed the complications, outsourced the history. I wasn't a villain, just a variable, and variables get eliminated. That night, I labeled a second folder "What They Don't Know." Inside it, I placed a printed list of everything I had paid for in the past 10 years, tuition deposits, auto repairs, the first 6 months of their mortgage. I didn't tally it up. I didn't need the number, I needed the record. Both folders, final rights and what they don't know, went into the back of my closet, behind the coat Harlan used to wear when he took Nova to the park. As I closed the door, I whispered aloud, not with venom, but with clarity. They planned their life without me. I'm simply returning the favor. The envelope looked harmless lavender with silver cursive swirls. I opened it on the porch, letting the sun hit my shoulders as I slid the card out. To my real mom, thank you for being everything. It read, with hearts embossed in gold foil. My fingers stopped. Inside, it was signed in Nova's handwriting, the kind Celine always traced with pencil first. I turned the envelope over. No mistake. My name on the front, my address. But the message wasn't for me. It was never meant to be read by the woman holding it. I didn't cry. I didn't tear it up. I filed it next to the gas bill. Bills or facts. This card was to... That evening, the house felt like a hollow stage after the lights dim. I poured a small glass of wine, not for comfort, but to keep my hands occupied, and opened the home security app. Before I revoked access, I'd set it to back up footage from the shared property. Curiosity drove me, or maybe instinct. I scrolled to a clip from 3 days ago. The camera showed the porch Celine and Dorian standing beside a delivery box. "She'll forget, eventually," Celine said, her voice crystal clear. "Old people do. Just smile and give her cookies." My hand clenched around the phone. I replayed it once, then twice, then downloaded the video without blinking. I renamed the file Remember Me Clearly MP4 and saved it to a USB drive. The folder in the filing cabinet opened easily. I tucked the drive between the legal papers and the insurance summary. If they think forgetfulness is part of aging, they've underestimated my memory. I sat back down and stared at the wall for several long minutes. Not to think, but to let the anger settle in layers like sediment in a river. It was no longer hot. It was structured. The next morning, I walked to the bakery down the street. A small treat, I told myself. Just one chocolate croissant. But fate likes to be punctual. As I stood by the pastry case, Celine's voice carried from the custom cake counter. "Make sure it says Mother Boss in gold," she told the clerk, holding her phone like a mirror. I turned my head slowly, not out of interest but confirmation. She was alone, focused, and smiling. I left without buying anything. My hands stayed at my sides. My heart didn't race. But my eyes, they didn't blink. At home. I sat at my desk and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. I titled it, "For the Ones Who Will Ask Why She Didn't Say Something." It wasn't a will, not legally, but it was a record. I wrote the date. I wrote how many times I had been erased softly, and how many times I had let it happen out of love that deserved better. I listed facts, not accusations. The kind of facts people tend to forget unless someone writes them down. I didn't seal it. I didn't even fold it. It wasn't time. Not yet. The folders in my closet had grown thicker. I added the new document behind the bank statements. Then I pulled the USB from its case and stared at the label I'd written. Remember Me Clearly. It didn't make me feel proud, but it made me feel prepared. I lined up everything co-signed documents, screenshots, dates, amounts. They wanted me quiet, I said aloud, my voice even. I gave them silence. Now, I'll give them consequence. The email came just after I'd finished watering the geraniums. Subject line, suspicious activity, secondary account notification. I clicked it, my pulse still steady. The login attempt was traced to a device registered as a trusted contact. That status had been set years ago, when I'd been recovering from gallbladder surgery and needed someone Dorian to manage bills. I thought I'd cleared that access. Apparently, I was wrong. Or maybe he had kept something, paperwork, a code, a saved login I never knew about. My fingers hovered over the mouse, then moved to print, not panic preparation. I filed the printouts in my Remember Me Clearly folder, slotting them beside the USB drive and the photo of Dorian's mortgage co-signature. The folder was thick now, a quiet anthology of my own erasure. If they want silence, I murmured, sealing the folder shut. They won't like the sound of my proof. I didn't write a script. I didn't rehearse. But I did choose my clothes with care. A soft blue blouse, simple earrings, no makeup. I wanted to look exactly like the woman they thought they could ignore. Sunday afternoon, I drove to Dorian and Selene's house without calling first. I parked behind their car, took the folder from the passenger seat, and walked to the door. Selene answered. She looked surprised, but only for a moment. "Arlena," she said. "No, Mom. No, hello." On just the name, like a formality. "I need 10 minutes, I said, stepping past her. Dorian was in the living room, half rising from the couch. "Everything okay?" he asked. I placed the folder on the coffee table and sat down across from them. "Not everything," I replied. "But let's begin." I opened the folder, exposing the documents one by one. Account alerts, signature records, loan transfers. Their faces shifted. Dorian confused, Selene unreadable. Selene's voice was the first to break the silence. "This feels confrontational." I smiled, not warmly. Truth usually is when it's been ignored. Just then, the hallway creaked, and a young woman stepped into view, early 20s, in scrubs. I recognized her from a prior visit, Erica, the part-time cleaner. She paused, unsure whether to leave. "Sorry," she said. "I just finished the kitchen." Selene waved her off, but Erica hesitated. Her eyes darted to the table. "I remember," she said slowly. "You were going to repaint the house after she moved out. Permanently. I think you said." The room froze. Erica looked confused, realizing she'd said something wrong. "That's what you said to the delivery guy." "Right." Dorian's mouth opened, but no words followed. Selene cleared her throat. She misunderstood. I turned toward her. "No." She heard exactly what you wanted her to. "You speak like a woman who always has an audience." Dorian stared at the rug. His hands were still. His silence was heavier than Selene's excuses. Erica, awkward, grabbed her tote bag and murmured goodbye. I thanked her as she passed. She gave me a small, uncertain smile. Selene straightened in her chair. "We never meant harm." I stood. "You meant convenience." I slid the folder closed. "You've built a life that doesn't require me. I've built a record that doesn't forgive you." Dorian looked up. "Mom, this isn't it is," I interrupted. "It is exactly what it looks like." I picked up the folder and held it against my side like a shield. I brought evidence, not emotion. You two brought silence. Let's see which one leaves a louder legacy. I walked to the door. No one followed. The missed call came mid-afternoon, flashing on my screen while I was refolding towels. Gaskin residence, the caller ID read. I stared at it for a few seconds. My thumb hovered, then dropped away. I let it go to voicemail. But curiosity's a quiet companion. I called back a few minutes later. The line rang twice before a small voice answered, high and unfiltered. "Hello, it was Nova." My chest tightened. "Hi, Sweet Pea," I said. "Is Daddy there?" A beat. Then she whispered, as if sharing a secret. "Daddy said Grandma's not fun anymore. That's why we don't visit." The words didn't land like a slap. They settled, like dust. "Thank you for picking up, sweetheart," I replied gently. "Tell Daddy I called." I hung up before my voice could falter. I didn't cry, but my hands trembled. I gripped the counter's edge until the marble felt warm. That wasn't Nova's thought. They taught her that, not with lessons, but with absence. With sighs exchanged when I wasn't in the room, with explanations disguised as kindness. I walked to the living room and pulled open the bottom drawer of the old oak cabinet. Photo albums slid forward. I chose the yellow one, Nova's toddler years. Her fingers wrapped around mine in every page. Her first steps in my garden, icing on her nose from the first cupcake we baked. Those memories hadn't vanished, but their meaning was now being rewritten by others. Later that evening, I opened my laptop to browse for a second-hand pruning tool. My rose bushes needed trimming. Scrolling through the listings, I paused. There it was, a vintage gold locket, oval, engraved with a delicate H. My heart skipped. I clicked. Seller Selena style. Caption, gift ready. Never worn. Timeless piece. My fingers curled into my palm. It couldn't be. I zoomed in. The chain, slightly tarnished at the clasp Harlan had replaced himself. Inside the open locket, a faint scratch in the shape of a heart, etched when I dropped it in the sink 20 years ago. This wasn't a copy. It was mine. I leaned back in the chair. My breath came steady, despite the weight. I didn't message the seller. I didn't comment or call. Instead, I took a screenshot. Then I printed the listing and filed it into the folder labeled What They Sold. My thought, they don't steal objects. They steal the meaning inside them, and they sell it for pennies in exchange for space, for stories they prefer to tell instead. The locket once held a photo of Harlan, then Nova. It had held lives. Now it held a price tag. That night, I pulled out the last scrapbook I'd kept for myself, the one where I only pasted moments that felt unfinished. The last page was still blank. I glued the printout of the locket listing onto the thick paper. I didn't decorate, just captioned it beneath with black ink, "You can't buy back what you throw away." I closed the book slowly, letting the weight settle. I laid the letter flat on the dining table, smoothing the corners one last time before folding it in thirds. No fluff, no flourish, just truth. Dear Dorian and Celine, it began. Effective immediately. I will no longer be financially accessible to either of you. This includes, but is not limited to, inheritance considerations, loan co-signatures, or emergency assistance. If I am no longer mother in your world, then let my name no longer carry your debts. I signed it, dated it, and sealed the envelope. There was no shaking in my hands, no tremor of hesitation, only steadiness. This wasn't revenge, it was clarity, the kind that no longer waits for understanding. I didn't make a ceremony out of mailing it. I slipped on my shoes, drove to the post office, and dropped the letter into the blue box like it was any other bill. There was no pause at the opening, no whispered goodbye, just metal meeting metal. On the walk back to my car, I exhaled not in relief, but completion, like finishing a long book you didn't enjoy, but needed to read, back home. I placed the stamp receipt in a drawer. That was the end of one kind of record, and the beginning of another. Later that night, an email pinged my inbox. The subject line read, "Urgent loan default notification." It was from my old mortgage broker. I frowned. I hadn't applied for anything in years. I opened it and froze. The email detailed late fees from a renovation loan secured with equity backing from a property listed under my name. I stared at the figures. The address matched Dorian and Celine's house. My name appeared as initial guarantor. I hadn't signed anything recently, but old documents, apparently, had found new uses. My fingers went cold. I dialed Corbin LeClaire, my lawyer. He answered on the second ring. "Corbin," I said, "We've got a problem." I forwarded the email. He scanned it quickly. "This looks like they leveraged a dormant authorization, something you never formally revoked." I didn't raise my voice. "Can we stop it?" "Yes," he replied. "We can file a cease and demand letter immediately." I breathed in through my nose. "Good. Do it. And send a copy to them with the check they forgot they never earned." The next morning, I opened the filing cabinet and removed the 3 folders already thick with history. Remember me clearly, what they sold. Final rights. I created a 4th, what they took. I printed the bank email, added it to the new folder, and labeled the spine in permanent marker. It was oddly satisfying. If they ever say I left nothing for them, I'll have documentation of what they tried to take. Not because I needed revenge, because I needed the truth to outlive their version of it. That night, I retrieved a blank journal I'd bought months ago on a whim. The cover was soft linen, a muted green. I wrote on the first page, "The life I started at 65. The ink glided across the paper. My hand didn't pause. My breath didn't catch. Below that, I added the first line, "Today." I chose a future that doesn't ask permission. I closed the journal gently. The quiet wasn't loneliness. It was space. And finally, it was mine. The shelves had been neglected for years, not from dust, but inertia. I pulled down books one by one, stacking titles I hadn't opened since Dorian was in high school. Gardening guides, paperbacks with faded covers, a poetry collection Harlan had loved but never finished. I was preparing for a donation run, making space, not because I needed it, but because I deserved it. Clearing the shelves felt like exhaling, like finally telling the room I was ready to make room for new things. A paperback slid sideways, and something thin fluttered to the floor. I bent down and picked up a yellowed slip of paper, folded once. Harlan's handwriting, instantly recognizable. The looped H, the slanted T. I sat down with it in my lap and opened the note. "In case they forget who you are, remember who you were before them. You were everything I built from." My hands trembled not from grief, but from recognition. I hadn't known this note existed. He must have tucked it away, knowing I'd find it when I needed it most. And somehow, he was right. I held it to my chest, not to cry, but to steady myself. I wasn't sad. I was full of clarity. I stepped into the backyard, the afternoon sun soft on my shoulders. The rosemary bush was overgrown, the tomato vines gone wild, but the basil still pushed upward with stubborn life. I knelt down to trim a few sprigs, the scent strong and familiar. This was the garden Harlan had started, the one we swore we'd tend into old age. I had let parts of it go, just like I'd let parts of myself disappear inside their expectations. But the roots were still here. So was I. I didn't lose them. I whispered. I let them step aside so I could finally stand. On my way back inside, I saw Joanne from next door walking her dog. She waved and crossed the yard. "Heard things got a little tense last week," she said gently. No gossip in her voice, just quiet concern. We reached a point, I said, where silence became healthier than hope. She didn't flinch, just nodded. "Good," she said. "That kind of silence is sacred." We stood there for a moment in mutual understanding, 2 women who'd been through enough to stop explaining. Later that evening, I took out a sheet of stationery and wrote a letter not to Dorian or Celine, but to myself. "Dear Arlena," I began, "you are not what they remember. You are what you rebuilt." I signed it, folded it, and tucked it into the folder with Harlan's note. No need for postage, just presence. Before bed, I pulled down the old photo albums. I flipped past birthdays and vacations until I reached the Mother's Day page from 6 years ago. There it was, a family photo. Everyone smiling. Everyone centered except me. I had been cropped at the edge, a shoulder and a hand barely visible. I slid the photo from its frame, replaced it with one from 1987. Harlan and I, grinning beside tomato vines, dirt on our jeans, joy in our eyes. The past hadn't vanished. It had simply needed recentering. The morning air at Silver Haven carried the scent of turned soil and budding lavender. I stood just off-center in the modest community garden, near the new resource room, its door freshly painted sage green. Inside was a plaque, the Whitlow Room, dedicated to restoration. Not resentment. They'd asked me to say a few words at the spring donor ceremony. I hadn't prepared a speech. I simply stepped forward when called, hands clasped in front of me. I was once erased, I said. Now I've made room for others to be seen. There was no applause, just soft nods from the room. It was the most sacred silence I'd ever known. That afternoon, back in my cottage, I found an envelope in my mailbox, Dorian's handwriting. The stamp was dated weeks ago, probably before the cease and demand letter reached them. I sat at my desk, opened it slowly. I don't know where things went wrong. It began. A mix of guilt and self-pity. He mentioned Nova, how confused she'd become. He didn't say sorry. He asked if we could talk, but it wasn't an invitation, it was a preservation tactic. I read the first 2 paragraphs, then folded it shut. It wasn't an apology. It was a lifeboat he was offering himself. That night, I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out a small brown box. Inside were copies of everything the house deed, the revocation forms, the legal letters, and one USB labeled Inheritance Choices. I added Dorian's letter to the pile and closed the lid. On top of the box, I taped a note in clean block letters. For when you're ready to understand, not defend. I didn't seal it, I didn't address it. I placed it at the back of my closet, not hidden, just waiting. I didn't need to send it. The gift wasn't the contents, it was the clarity. On Saturday, I knelt beside Gloria as we planted lavender along the northern path. She wore gardening gloves with tiny sunflowers stitched on the cuffs. "You didn't lose your family, Arlena," she said as she pressed a root ball into the earth. "You just stopped negotiating your worth." I smiled without answering. We worked side by side, sleeves rolled, dirt on our knees, surrounded by others who knew what it meant to be needed for the wrong reasons and what it meant to be chosen for the right ones. That evening, I sat with a cup of chamomile tea, scrapbook on my lap. I flipped through pages slowly, each one familiar. I paused at a photo of Nova, aged 4, grinning with a garden hose. I didn't remove it, but I didn't stop there, either. I turned to the last page, blank until now, and tucked it between gardening books on the shelf, not in the family archive, in my living archive. This was still motherhood, but it had evolved. It no longer asked for proof. Before bed, I retrieved Harlan's old envelope. Inside, his note still rested. I folded a fresh page, wrote a single sentence, and tucked it in beside his. They called it silence. I called it peace. And it was the loudest thing I ever gave myself. I sealed the envelope. No need to send it. It had already arrived inside me. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to shout, it's to walk away with your head held high and your dignity intact. I didn't write this story for revenge. I lived it to reclaim my worth. We often talk about love in terms of what we give, but what about what we protect? Sometimes, self-respect is the last gift we forget to wrap for ourselves. If you've ever felt like you were erased from your own family's story, know this: you're not alone, and you're not powerless. You get to decide what legacy you leave behind. Not every mother's love looks like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like boundaries. What about you? Have you ever had to choose peace over proximity? Have you ever been written out of a narrative and decided to write your own instead? If this story touched something in you, comment 1 or let me know where you're watching from. If it didn't, I'd still love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my shoes? And if you want to follow more stories like this, stories about resilience, quiet strength, and the wisdom that only comes with age, make sure you subscribe to this channel. There's always more to learn and more hearts to reach.